41st chapter of Genesis ends with famine having settled over the entire Middle East. But it wasn't unforeseen. Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob, foretold it in response to Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt's request that he interpret a dream that the ruler had had. Well, as foretold, famine settled over the entire region after a 7-year stint of amazing bounty. Forewarned of the trouble to come, Pharaoh appointed Joseph as the prime minister of Egypt to oversee the preparation of the days of famine. Joseph had then overseen the development of a new agency of Egypt's already labyrinthine government, which oversaw the collection of a 20% tax in the years of plenty to store up in preparation for the times of famine. Well, the story is now going to shift back to Jacob's family. We read in verse 1. When Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." So the scene shifts from Egypt back to Canaan, where Joseph's family lives. Jacob is his father. His sons mentioned here are Joseph's brothers. You'll remember had sold him into slavery about 20 years before. They'd neither seen nor heard of him in all that time, and they likely assumed that he had died. Jacob looks at their reserves. He sees that they're running thin, and so he tells his sons to head to south to get supplies. Verse 3. So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt, but Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. And the sons of Israel went to buy grain among those who journeyed, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Joseph's 10 older brothers set out on a mission to get relief from the famine that had taken hold over the entire Middle East. They all went because they needed the cargo capacity of all of them to provide for the household. The only brother who didn't go was Joseph's younger brother Benjamin. And Jacob assumed that Joseph had been killed years before because his brothers brought him his bloody clothes. Jacob assumes that Benjamin was the sole surviving son of his favorite wife, Rachel. He was not about to allow the boy out of his sight. And I say boy, but Benjamin was probably a young man at this point, well into his 20s. Verse 6, Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. As the prime minister of Egypt overseeing the distribution of the reserves that Egypt had set in store for the famine, Joseph decided which foreigners, if any, would receive assistance. So there he sits one day when a party of Hebrews appears before him, and he recognizes them, though they don't recognize him. Hopeful of favor, they bow to Joseph, fulfilling his dream from so many years before. Verse 7, Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. Then he said to them, Where do you come from? And they said, From the land of Canaan to buy food. So Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And they don't recognize him because it's been, 20 years, and he's gone native. Now, as we'll see in a bit, he deals with them through an interpreter. And as custom required, they kept their heads bowed and were careful not to just stare at him. He began by speaking to them as would be expected of an Egyptian official dealing with, riffraff foreigners. He was gruff, rough, acting as though he's, mildly suspicious of them. He's playing his part as prime minister of Egypt, not a son of Jacob and brother to these guys. Verse 9. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them and said to them, You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land. Now, charging them with espionage, that was serious. The Egyptians were paranoid about their neighbors attacking. A time of famine, when lots of foreigners were going to Egypt for supplies, would be, that'd be a perfect cover for spies to scout out Egypt's defenses and get the lay of the land. And of course, if spies were caught, they were interrogated by torture and then, of course, executed. Well, as the story unfolds, we see that Joseph's not squeezing them here to get even with them for what they had done years before. Revenge is not his motive. Rather, he applies pressure to discover what kind of men they've become. Are they the same guys who treated him cruelly? Or have the years changed them? Verse 10, And they said to him, No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. For we are all one man's sons. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies. But he said to them, No, but you have come to see the nakedness of the land. It looked a little suspicious that there were 10 of them, and so they explained that they were in fact all brothers. Joseph pushed back, most likely so they would offer more information about the family, which of course he was anxious to have. He wanted to know how his father and his younger brother were. Verse 13. And they said, your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan, and in fact, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more. Oh, meaning, of course, Joseph. They pass off to this, what they assume is an Egyptian official, the same tale that they told their father, that Joe was dead. They weren't about to tell him the truth. None of them saying, hey, we sold our little brother into slavery a while back. You wouldn't happen to have heard of him, would you? We'd love to hook up with him if he's still here so that we can have nachos and Coke. Joseph listens to their reply, but seems intractable. Verse 14. But Joseph said to them, it is as I spoke to you, saying, you are spies. And then there's likely a pause as he lets them stand there, wondering what fate he'll decide for them. 3 times now he's affirmed they're spies. They are to scout out Egypt's weaknesses. And then he opens a door of hope, verse 15. In this manner you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you and let him bring your brother, and you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be tested to see whether there is any truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh surely you are spies. So he put them all together in the prison for 3 days. Joseph's goal in all of this was to see what they would do under pressure. If they were the same cruel creeps who'd sold him 20 years before, it wouldn't be long until they were at each other's throats. And remember that Jacob had made it clear that he intended to pass the family's inheritance on to Joseph. That's why the brothers were so jealous of him and plotted to get rid of him. The reason that Jacob was going to give Joe the inheritance was because he was the firstborn son of his favorite wife, Rachel. Rachel only had one other son, Joseph's younger brother, Benjamin. She died giving birth to him. Well, Joseph missed his little brother badly. But he wanted to find out what his other brother's attitude would be towards Benjamin now that Joseph was out of the picture. Surely Jacob's plan was to make Benjamin the main heir with the firstborn birthright. Were his brothers plotting some accident for Benjamin as they had for Joseph? Joseph does all of this to find out his brother's intentions regarding his brother Benjamin. He says all but one of them are to stay in Egypt until they bring Benjamin back to prove they really are a family, and as they claimed. And then he sticks them in a prison for 3 days to work it out. And then it seems that Joseph had a change of mind. One could not carry back enough supplies for the whole family if they were indeed from one family. And so, verse 18, then Joseph said to them the 3rd day, do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined to your prison house, but you go and carry grain for the famine of your houses. And bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die. And they did so. So that last phrase means that their audience with who they assumed was a high Egyptian official is now over. And so they turn to each other and they begin to talk. Joseph looks away, but he's in fact listening to them. You see, he had spoken through an interpreter before, but of course he knew Hebrew. He could understand them perfectly as they turned to each other to discuss what had just happened. Verse 21. Then they said to one another, we are truly guilty concerning our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. Though 2 decades have passed since selling Joseph into slavery, their conscience still bothers them. They see what's happening to them now as, well, kind of cosmic payback. One of them will have to stay in Egypt while the rest return home to tell Pops they've lost yet another brother. That's when the eldest, Reuben, pipes in with an, I told you so, verse 22. And Reuben answered them, saying, did I not speak to you, saying, do not sin against the boy? And you would not listen. Therefore, behold, his blood is now required of us. In chapter 37, when the brothers first plotted to get rid of Joseph, they planned to kill him. Reuben suggested they instead put him in a pit and leave him there. His plan was to come back later and rescue Joseph. But Judah had come up with a plan to sell him to a passing caravan before Reuben could veto it. Verse 23. But they did not know that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them through an interpreter. And he turned himself away from them and wept. Then he returned to them again and talked with them, and he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. Joseph saw their remorse and was overwhelmed with emotion. He'd forgiven them and ached to be reconciled. But he had to be sure they were safe to be reconciled too. And the only way to gauge that was by seeing their attitude towards Benjamin. If I could camp out here for just a moment, he wanted to forgive them, but he needed to know that it was safe to be reconciled to them. This is something that I think is important for us as followers of Christ to understand. The New Testament, especially the teachings of Jesus, are filled with the call to forgive. You may remember the story of Peter coming to Jesus, and Peter's getting to the point where he thinks that he's really starting to learn the lessons of grace and forgiveness and mercy that Jesus has been teaching and modeling for them. And so rising, to the occasion, Peter says, "Lord, if my brother sins against me, how many times should I forgive him? 7 times?" And Jesus says something remarkable. He says, "No, I do not say 7 times. I say 70 times 7. Now, Jesus is obviously not saying that we should forgive people 490 times, as though we would count up the number of times that we've forgiven someone. The number 7 is a number that speaks of completion, fulfillment. When Jesus said 70 times 7, he's saying you don't keep track of forgiveness. You forgive. It doesn't matter how many times it is. Over and over again, the teaching of Jesus, forgive or you are not forgiven. The idea is this: when grace has touched our heart, when we have experienced the mercy of God, it changes us so that we become forgiving. We don't just receive forgiveness, we become a channel through which forgiveness flows. And a spiritual test of whether, in fact, we have indeed received the forgiveness of God is if we are forgiving of others. Now, this teaching is shared a lot in churches of really every denomination because it is such a prominent feature in the teaching of Christ. But the problem is that some people really get stuck on the call to forgive others because they don't make a distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation. And they have been sinned against again and again and again. And they understand that they need to let go of the desire for revenge. But they think that if they were to forgive, it would require them to treat the person who hasn't just sinned in the past against them, but keeps sinning against them, to pretend as though this person isn't toxic, isn't sinful, isn't abusive in their behavior. Forgiveness and reconciliation are 2 different things. Forgiveness is the choice to let go of the right to get even. It's discharging people's debts towards us and committing them into God's hand, that God would deal with them rather than us. Remember what we read in Hebrews, that the Lord says, vengeance is his. He will repay. That is not ours. He is the dealer and doler of justice. We are not. Not in interpersonal relationships. We are to forgive. But please hear me, that does not equal reconciliation. Reconciliation is the normalization of a relationship, where we abide in a relationship with someone, where we continue to have a relationship with them in such a way where there's communication, where there's mutuality. The reality is there are certain people with whom we cannot be at peace because they will not be at peace with us. As much as lies with us, we must be willing to be at peace with others. But not all will be at peace with us. We can't be reconciled to some people, meaning we can't pretend that they are not going to leverage our openness to them as another opportunity to sin. So we forgive in the sense that we give up the sense of our right to get even wanting the person to experience pain because they've pained us, they've hurt us. But that does not mean that we pretend that they're a safe person for us to be in relationship with. Reconciliation is, again, the normalization of the relationship. It's effectively saying, I trust you. There can be no reconciliation if the person is not trustworthy. And they've proven they're not trustworthy time and time and time again. Bring all of that back now into the story of Joseph and his brothers. It's been 20 years. They appear before him. His last interaction with them was brutal. He listened to them talk about killing him. Then they decide not to do that, and they sell him into slavery. They take their own flesh and blood, and they sell him. Why? For the birthright? They're willing to put monetary gain over the affiliation connection of blood. Joseph has forgiven them. It's clear by his lifestyle and what we read on, what he does with them. He has forgiven them, but he doesn't know if he can be reconciled to them because he doesn't know if they can be trusted. So all that he's doing here is an attempt to discover, have they changed? Has the last 20 years altered them? Have they looked back with regret on what they did? And if they could go back to that moment with what they know, what they know now, would they not do what they did with me back then? And the only way that he can judge that is by how they're treating Benjamin, because Benjamin now would be the one upon whom the promise of the birthright would go as the favored son of their father, who had already made clear that he would give the birthright to Joseph. Joseph's out of the picture. So Benjamin's next in line to receive that birthright. You see what he's doing? It's a perfect illustration to us of the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. He has to determine if these guys are worthy of being reconciled to, if it's safe to be reconciled to them. That Joseph picked Simeon as the one to keep in jail hints that it was he who had come up with the plot to get rid of Joseph in the first place. The massacre of the Shechemites had been Simeon's idea, so we know he's cruel, treacherous. By removing Simeon from his brothers, his counsel wouldn't be there to poison them. Verse 25, then Joseph gave a command to fill their sacks with grain, to restore every man's money to his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. Thus he did for them. And so they loaded their donkeys with the grain and departed from there. But as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey feed at the encampment, he saw his money, and there it was in the mouth of his sack. And so he said to his brothers, my money has been restored, and there it is in my sack. Then their hearts failed them, and they were afraid, saying to one another, what is this that God has done to us? So the money that they had taken was for buying supplies. If they were stopped and inspected by one of the many Egyptian patrols that moved along the route that they took home, well, it would look like they had stolen the grain. Their sense of guilt is already running high because of their close encounter with the suspicious Egyptian prime minister. They're ready for the hammer to fall at any moment. Verse 29, then they went to Jacob their father in the land of Canaan and told him all that had happened to them, saying, the man who is the Lord of the land spoke roughly to us and took us for spies of the country. But we said to him, we are honest men, we are not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no more, and the youngest is with our father this day in the land of Canaan. Then the man, the Lord of the country, said to us, by this I will know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me, take food for the famine of your households, and be gone. And bring your youngest brother to me, so that I shall know that you are not spies, but that you are honest men. I will grant your brother to you, and you may trade in the land. Then it happened as they emptied their sacks that surprisingly each man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were afraid. And Jacob their father said to them, you bereaved me. Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and you want to take Benjamin? All these things are against me. What Jacob says here calls us to compare Joseph's faith to his father's. Though Joseph endured great and unjust hardship, he trusted God was doing something in the midst of it all. He chose to keep his eyes on God rather than his circumstances. It seems Jacob did the opposite. He allowed the glory and the goodness of God to be eclipsed by his circumstances. Now, we know that in all of this, God was working to effect a joyful reunion between the Father and the Son. But what does Jacob say? All these things are against me. Joseph would say with the Apostle Paul, all things work together for good to those who love God and are the called according to his purpose. Christian, are all things against you or working together for good? Verse 37. Then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you. What a foolish thing to say. What comfort would Jacob gain by killing his grandsons? Reuben speaks out of frustration at his father's obstinacy. Simeon is in prison and will only be released when Benjamin is brought. Unless they take Ben back with them, there'll be no more relief from Egypt. Verse 38. But he said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If any calamity should befall him on the way in which you go, then you would bring my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. This is foolish. Jacob condemns his entire household to starvation, including his precious Benjamin. This is the statement of a man who can rise to great heights of faith in God and then turn right around and sink to the depths of doubt. Many would criticize Jacob at this point. Their criticism is not without merit. I find instead encouragement in Jacob's stumbling. Because in Hebrews 11, the Bible's hall of faith, Jacob is held up among others as an example, not of doubt, but of faith. You see, in God's economy, faith prevails over doubt. It seems that an ounce of faith answers a pound of doubt.